Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, Friday afternoon. Thanks for giving us a little bit of your time. As I said last week, we know it's a busy time of day, kind of around the afternoon editorial meetings. So we're really grateful for those of you that can be with us, and for those that can't, we will be archiving this so folks can watch it later. Let me start by saying we really intend these to be conversations. And so uh, my colleague and daughter, Barrett, is here with me and monitoring your comments. If you have questions, please throw them in. We'll stop along the way and have some place for that, but also fine just kind of to stop as we go and as we talk about these things. What we're doing here is based, or at least structured, based on the guide we've written for talent covering COVID-19. If you don't have that already, you can get it easily at barrynashandcompany.com. It's right there on the top of the very first page. And you'll see that it is structured the way that we're structuring these conversations. Last week, we talked about managing your thinking. Today, we're going to talk about managing your speaking. And then next week, we will talk about managing your doing. And so a lot of what we'll be discussing is also is there for you also. Of course, when we talk about managing your speaking, we'll be talking about a couple of things. We'll be talking about both what you say and how you say it. But before we do that this afternoon, I actually want to go back to talk a little bit about managing your thinking, because after we talked last week, I started to get questions from people, and I got one question that I thought was especially important and actually extraordinarily important, maybe the most important question that anybody will ask as we kind of work through this process. And I'll read it here for you and then we'll talk about it. But the question was, how do you keep your energy and your enthusiasm up when you're in a time of profound professional insecurity? You don't even know if you will have a job in the next 6 months. And I think that's an extraordinarily important question. I talked a lot last week about managing your thinking and about how the way you think about the viewer is so important. But the one thing that's more important than that, more important than anything, is the way that you think about yourself. And for some of us, that's a more difficult issue than it is for others. I will tell you that I'm one of those people personally, when I really start to dwell on the things that I can't control, I get terrified and I spiral into an inner dialogue with myself that is, voices in my head just going on and on about the mistakes I've made and the things I've done wrong and the things I should have done, in the choices I should have made instead of the choices that I made. And that's a really difficult and terrible place to be. And I will even tell you, I'm one of those people who sought professional help for that. And so if you're in a spiral to that extent, and I'm not suggesting that the person who asked me this question is, but if you are, I think first of all, it's important the most important thing is to find someone or some way that can help you manage that conversation about yourself. It's a very real thing, and we're in a very difficult time for for many, many people, it's important to acknowledge that it's difficult for all of us in one way or another. If you don't need to go to that length, then it may be important for you to at least share your anxiety with someone who really does care about you and loves you and can remind you that thing we all need to be reminded of, which is that you are more than your job. And my daughter sitting here, and she'd laugh if I claimed to be anything other than a workaholic. The downside of that is when it reaches the extent that I start to identify with my job so much that I forget that there is a lot more to me than that. And sometimes we all need people in our lives to remind us of that. So if you need that conversation, I want to encourage you to find it. I think there's a third piece of this that is tremendously important and meaningful, and that is to understand that your own anxiety and your own suffering and your own fear around things like your work and your livelihood is something that many, many millions of people are feeling right now, especially the people who are watching you. And so, as difficult as it is, as much as we would not wish it on anyone, it is also your way of understanding what the people who are turning to you are going through. And one thing we do know is that more and more people are turning to you and turning to those of us who work in news. And they're doing that because they feel afraid, because they feel anxious, because they are hoping that you can provide something that they are feeling a need for. And so, again, I thought that was a very important and very, very profound question, not just because it goes to something that's personal for all of us, which is that there's nothing more important than the conversation we're having with ourselves about ourselves, but it also goes to the very heart of our work, which is the idea that people don't just need information from us. They have an emotional relationship to that information. And it's really important that we understand that. And of course, that has implications for delivery and for the way that we talk to people. So we're going to talk about managing your speaking. And I guess I want to stop before I jump into that and just make sure. Do we have any questions, Barrett? Anything? All right, great. Okay, well, I was going to say, if anybody's got a question or anything else to say about that, then please do. Again, I'd much prefer we have a dialogue here than a monologue by a bald man with a big nose. Talking about managing your speaking, we're really talking about that in two parts. We're talking about, of course, what you say and literally the language you use, and then we're talking about how you say it. And we'll talk a lot more about that in a few minutes, but the how you say is really a conversation about some very specific dynamics, because when you speak, you're using three tools essentially. You're using pitch, which is the way you use the notes in your voice. Your voice is like an instrument. It's got low notes, it's got high notes, it's got a lot of notes in between. So we're talking about pitch and the way you use pitch. We're talking about pace, how fast or slowly you speak. And we're talking about volume, how much you project, and how loudly you speak. So we'll talk about all those in detail in just a few minutes. I want to start by talking, though, about what we say. I think there's a very interesting conversation right now for us to have with each other about the way we're writing and the way we are languaging things. Even before the pandemic, there was a lot of conversation about authenticity, and especially about folks who are in the demo, millennials especially, have little or no patience for anything they perceive as being inauthentic. And I think there's an interesting history of that. I believe I mentioned last week when we talked that when I was a kid, being on TV was still a miracle. Only the very privileged few got to talk to a camera. And it was such a big deal. People put on suits and ties if they went to TV stations. That's how special those environments were and how rarefied those environments were. Well, we've got a generation of viewers now who grew up with FaceTime. They grew up with talking to a camera as just one way people talk to each other. Now, what they were doing was not as difficult as what you do, because even though they were on FaceTime, they could still see the person on the other side of it. And the real challenge to doing what most of you do as well as you do it is the fact that you can't see them, because human communication evolved based on our ability to see the other person. So talking to a camera without the ability of seeing your listener, as we said last week, is a fundamentally inhuman thing. But we've now got a generation that is used to this as just an everyday feeling kind of conversation. You know, it's actually interesting. Going back before all this, I would say that in all the years that I've been looking at research of talent and actually leading focus groups and talking to people and asking people, well, why do you love anchor A and so much and anchor B not so much? Well, I can tell you that 9 times out of 10, the answer is something like, well, I don't know. It feels like anchor A is just talking to me. I know she's probably reading just like the others are reading, but it's just not like she's reading. It's like she's just talking to me. And so there has long been a preference for what feels to people spontaneous and authentic. I actually think if you go back to some of those iconic moments we talked about last week, even with people like Cronkite, you'll see that the things that are memorable, that are most remembered, are not things that feel scripted. They feel somehow authentic. And so we have a really important question, which is, first of all, is it important that we cultivate that experience with our viewers? And if it is, what does that mean? So I will confess, I've got some real concerns about what I sometimes call journalistic affectations, but they're writing ways of writing that have at times been best practices and have served us very well. You know, things like eliminating gerunds and to be verbs to basically truly speak in headlines. And so those things have been important, and those things have made a real contribution. I've got a real concern now, and I think there's an interesting conversation we could all have about whether there could be a way that what was great at one time is now not so great for us, because there is a way that it literally does signal to people, I'm performing for you. I'm not talking to you. I'm not sharing, I'm announcing. And so as we get into the conversation of what should we be saying, I think that we have to be at least honest with ourselves about when we are using structures that signal we are not in a conversation with people. I think another sort of guideline, which has been a very good one and been a very important one, but I wonder now if it doesn't sometimes get in the way of doing our best work when it comes to what we say, is the guideline to always begin with the latest information, with the newest information. I think we ought to think about that for a couple of reasons. One is the newest information is not always the most critical or important information. Sometimes it's just the newest information, but even more importantly, that is not the way human beings tell stories. We don't begin by saying, the prince and the princess lived happily ever after. Once upon a time, blah, 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 blah. The human instinct, the thing we are hardwired to respond to is narrative. It is story. It is a thing that sets a scene and then leads to something. So I think there are certainly times that we bind ourselves in ways we don't need to, by always insisting that we start with with whatever the most recent fact is. As a matter of fact, when we work with reporters on live leads now, one of the things that we suggest to them or recommend to them is that they at least start by considering what's the point of the lead, where is it concluding, where is it going, so that in your head, instead of just saying what are the things I want to say and then working through a list, which basically means we're watching you work through a list, instead what you're doing is you are creating some momentum toward a point of some sort. The point may be as simple as police have no idea what to do next. And so you were saying, this really has police perplexed this morning, Jim. The Vice Squad looked at it. They couldn't come up with an answer. The forensics folks went out. They didn't know what to do. They even called in a psychic. They had no idea. She had no idea what to do. Police actually have no idea what to do at this point. And the quality of my delivery and the momentum of my delivery is because in my own mind, I know I'm building to something. Sometimes when we're coaching, we equate it to telling a joke. Once you know the punchline, once you know where something is going, not only does it become easy to remember the details of the joke, but it becomes easy to know how to tell it, how to create the world that will bring the punchline alive. And so at least another consideration when we're thinking about how do we language things is that, which is how much fidelity do we want and should we have to telling the story like a story. Now that does two things when you do that, and I think they're both very important. And I know all of you who are on air will attest to this, and that is, as a listener, when I begin to sense you are building to something, something in me gets excited, something in me sort of rises to that. And So I feel an energy I'm not going to feel always otherwise. And as a storyteller, I know you would say that when you are really involved in the work of leading up to something, it generates a kind of energy in you that may not necessarily be there otherwise. And so I'm not suggesting replacing one set of rules with another. I think that there is a place for everything, but that when we talk about how we talk to people, what language do we use? The answer is complex. And I do worry that sometimes in our understandable desire to manage this stuff as efficiently as possible with so much to get done in newsrooms, that the formulas sometimes get in the way of doing doing better work. There's one last thing that I would want to get on your radar about about language, or about uh, what you say, and that is, well, actually, I tell you what, I'm going to save that because I think that belongs somewhere else myself. I'm holding a thought. I promise I'll get to it in a minute. Uh, but two more things about how we talk to people before we talk about sort of the dynamics of it. One would be that I do think it is important to talk directly to people as much as possible. That anytime you can appropriately use second person, it's a smart idea to do that. Again, there's just something in me that gets excited and that gets activated when I feel and when I experience you addressing me directly. I was doing a coaching session earlier this week, and we actually had copy that said something like, people who use smartphones should be concerned about so and so. And we were laughing a little bit about that because, of course, almost everybody is using a phone or a smartphone of one kind or another. So just the little simple idea of, well, okay, if you have a smartphone, then you're going to be concerned about this, somehow felt more conversational, more real for me as the person on the other side of it. And then I think lastly, as you're considering languaging and what you're saying, it really goes back to the point I was making a moment ago about what we understand about what our viewers are going through. And that is simply making sure that we are asking ourselves, how does the anxiety and the fear that I know people are feeling cause me to want to talk about this? And again, that's just one of those questions that may or may not change what you do with any given story, but I think it's very, very important to ask it. And again, it goes back to something we talked about last week, which was understanding how the words you're using will land on the people who are listening to you. So I guess at least this part of it, I'd frame it more as, here's not a suggested formula for the what as far as what you say, but here are considerations that I think have real importance and real value as we consider all of this. And that is, especially, as I said, being relentlessly honest with ourselves about when we are talking to people in ways that signal we are not really talking to them. We're talking at them. We're performing something. So stopping there before we move on. Any questions? Anything? Okay, great. No questions. Well, again, please, thoughts, comments, questions, please chime in if you've got anything. So if we move on to the second piece of this, which is when it comes to speaking to people, the how you say it. We talked last week about the idea that there is research that has shown pretty clearly that the things that people use to decide some really important things about you, whether you know what you're talking about, whether you're really listening to them or pretending to listen, whether you are truly curious or just pretending to be curious about something. What we believe about you when it comes to those things has primarily to do with things other than the words you use. It has to do with the way they come out of you. And for those of you who like to really deep dive and get into this, I actually posted on the site this afternoon, both sites, barrynashandcompany.com, and also our group for conversation about performance and delivery, delivering news when news hurts. A link to the book I'm about to reference called Honest Signals. It's by a guy named Alex Pentland out of MIT. And his group a few years ago did a really extraordinary and fascinating thing, which is they designed a device called a sociometer that people could wear that was measuring everything except the words folks were using. So it was measuring how they were moving and when they were moving and how quickly they were talking and how quickly one was responding to another. So what it meant was for the first time in human history, we had big data about things like body language and vocal affect that we had never had before. And of course, their interest was in understanding, okay, if I know this about someone's body language, or I know this about someone's, the way they're speaking, what is it telling me about them? Can I analyze just that information and predict who the leaders are, predict who really knows what they're talking about? Actually, a number of things that are especially important to people who play the role that you play in your newscasts and in your communities, because you want to be regarded as leaders. You want to be regarded as experts. You want to be regarded as authentically curious and as team players. And so that they tested this in some kind of fun, interesting ways. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the concept of speed dating, which is, you get a bunch of people in a room, you have them talk to each other at little 2-minute intervals, and then they report back to the moderator about who they'd like to possibly have a follow-up date with. So they put these things on folks who were speed dating and found a remarkably high percentage of the time they could predict who would get the date and who wouldn't get the date without knowing anything about what people were saying to each other. All they had was the information about body language and vocal affect. They did the same thing with salary negotiations. And without knowing anything about what the negotiators said to each other, just knowing about their body language and the way they use their voices, they could predict not only who got the raise, but who got the biggest raise. And they upped the ante and they went to the Sloan School of Business and they tested this with sophisticated business presentations. They wanted to do that because, of course, that was the crew that was saying, hey, we're serious business people. How someone presents something is meaningless to us. We're just looking at numbers and we're making a decision based on the numbers. And they found that even there, they were able to predict more accurately than just standard probability who would get the money and who would not get the money. And it went on and on and on and on. They found with this information, they could actually uh, diagnose clinical depression as accurately as the gold standard psychological test at the time. So the message at the heart of that is the way you use your body and the way you use your voice is speaking profoundly about who you are in the world. And the MIT folks, if you check this book out, Honest Signals, that I've listed on the site, were so confident about their data that you'll see they published what I call recipes. But essentially, they're able to say, look, someone who really knows what they're talking about talks this way and moves this way. And this is how we subconsciously recognize that in people. So a lot of what I'm about to share, and today we're talking about it in relation to how you speak. Next week we'll talk about it in relation to how you move, comes out of that research. And one other thing about that, which I think I mentioned last week also, and in a way is remarkably comforting, while I'm about to give you what sound and will sound to you like the formulas for some of these things, and they are, what's also true, what the researchers found was that they are almost impossible to fake for any, at least for any given period of time. And so, as we said last week, I got a lot of comment about the statement I made about preparation being the mother of authenticity. And I think that that's a good reference point to keep in mind, that we're about to talk about the dynamics of speaking and telling stories and communicating with viewers. But at the very heart of it is whether you know what you're talking about and how well prepared you are, because unless you do, you can't address what I think is the first and most important thing about this. And it's actually not directly out of the MIT research, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it is fundamental. And that is, and goes to preparation. And that is, at the end of the day, you cannot really speak powerfully, not just unless you know what you're talking about, but unless you have made some choices, unless you have made some decision about what's important in what you're saying. I talked about it last week in terms of need, and that's exactly where I'm going here, which is you're not going to be able to speak truly powerfully unless you have made some decision in your own mind about what you need people to understand about a story. And again, as I said last week, I'm using the word need very deliberately, because when we need to be understood, it energizes something in us. And today we're talking about our voices, energize something in our voices and in some cases, reading, that we cannot access any other way. And so one way to very practically get at that, because this is where you will go subconsciously if you're thinking this way, is to start by asking, okay, what should be emphasized here? What do I want to emphasize here? And it is not beneath anybody, and should not be beneath anybody, no matter how experienced, to go into copy and to challenge yourself to choose emphases, to have conversation with yourself about what you believe should be emphasized. Here's why. In human communication, emphasis has a very specific function. It is there to define or to state either stated or implied contrast. It's literally the thing we use to engender understanding. And so a really good and simple way, an important way to test whether you've really got your mind in the right place on a story is to check yourself about, okay, what do I think should be emphasized here? What would I emphasize here? Often it's easy. Those of you who've worked with me know I like the simple example of a sentence like this: the truck was red, not blue. Well, there's a stated contrast there, right? It's red and blue. And so in conversation, that's where the emphases would happen without the conversant having to think about it. But if the sentence is the truck was red, you don't know what to emphasize unless you know what contrast is operable. If the idea is that the truck is red, not blue, yellow, or green, then the emphasis would be the truck was red, on the word red. But if the operable contrast is a discussion about a truck as opposed to a car or a bus or a plane, then the emphasis might be the truck was red. And if the idea is that the color has changed, then the emphasis might be the truck was red. So simple example, but it goes to a really important and critical understanding, which is, in a way, what you emphasize is everything, because what you emphasize demonstrates not only whether you know a story but it demonstrates whether you have made choices about what matters in that story. And so very, very good. And no one should ever be too experienced or above every now and then checking those choices. So I talked when we started this today about the dynamics of your speaking being falling into three categories: pitch, pace, and volume or projection. And I want to talk really specifically about them because they actually serve in their own rights really, really important functions. And to understand that, you've got to go back to the research. One of the things, as I mentioned a few moments ago, that the MIT people found as they were uncovering the signals that we send that reveal who we are, was that someone who really knows what they are talking about will tend to speak with what the researchers called high activity in the voice. And literally what they mean by that is that there'll be a lot of variation in pitch, in the range of pitch when they speak. Those of you who have played musical instruments or been singers, I know what I'm talking about when I talk about notes. If you don't understand that for some reason, then look around for a musician or someone who has a keyboard or something, and they can play and help you understand it. But your voice functionally is an instrument. You're moving air over vocal folds, and they're resonating in your head, and it's making sound. And that means, just like any instrument, you've got a wide range of notes you can use. You got low notes, you got high notes, and you've got middle notes, as I said, in between. Well, it turns out that someone who is an expert, someone who really knows what they are talking about, will tend to speak with a lot of expressiveness. And it is interesting. One of the things we notice when people start to talk to a camera and they don't have somebody else to look at and to talk to, is one of the things that will start to flatten out is the level of expressiveness. Sometimes it flattens out for other reasons. I had a talent telling me the other day that she was concerned about speaking expressively when something was serious. And so she was deliberately really narrowing the range of her voice and limiting the range, except for when she was just telling stories that she thought were somehow lighter. And so we had a good conversation about the idea that expressiveness is not what determines serious or not serious. That has to do with your demeanor. That's about something else. Expressiveness really tells us about a couple of things, and one of them being your level of expertise. By the way, leaders also speak with high activity in the voice, and so with a lot of range and a lot of range. And so whether you're dealing with serious stories or not so serious, range is almost always important. We talk about it sometimes. We say pitch is the language of conviction, that your ability to use pitch effectively tells us something about your conviction, which goes to, again, whether you really know what you're talking about or not, and how convicted you are about that. A couple of quick things about pitch, because I think there are a couple of tools that are habits people fall into and easy to deal with if you know how. One is what people sometimes call sing-songy reading, which is sing-songy is a repetitive up and down pattern. There's a thing similar to that, which is just sort of, I would call it patterned reading. It is everything sort of starts to sound the same, especially as reporters go from block to block in a story, or as anchors go from story to story. What often happens is subconsciously talent will go back to the same note in their voice every time they start something new. So it's an interesting thing. Whenever you start at the same note, it's easy to subconsciously fall into the habit of the successive notes sort of all being the same. So if you find that you've got a kind of repetitiveness or a patterning happening in the sound of your reading, one of the easiest and most effective ways to deal with that is just to make sure you're varying the pitch you use as you start stories or as you start blocks of track. Because if you vary where you start, there will just kind of be a natural reflexive varying of what follows that. If you want a really simple exercise to exercise your radar for this, pick a sentence, just any sentence from any story, and just play around with how many different ways you can start that in with your voice. Read it starting high, and then read it starting in the middle of your voice, then read it starting low in your voice. Remembering that none of those things are wrong. All of those are choices that can work. What's important, if I listen to a newscast or if I listen to a story, is that you use all of them, that there be some variety in that. And so just playing with pitch in the way you start things is can be a really, really smart thing to do. And exercising it will develop your ear for it, make it easy for you to do it when you're tracking or when you're on air reading. The same thing, by the way, applies to the ends of sentences or the ends of blocks or the ends of stories. It's really, really useful and can be smart to play around with how many different ways you can find to end something, because just practicing that it puts more tools in your toolbox. And the more of them you use, the more interesting you're going to sound to those of us who are listening to you. That actually goes to another point I want to make about the end of things that's not really pitch related, but it's something we don't talk about a lot. And that is just the idea that if you're an anchor, or a reporter for that matter, anytime you are finishing something, you can sometimes do as much good for your story and your show by ending strong as you can do by beginning strong. It's very easy subconsciously, as you get to the end of something, whether it's the end of the story or whether it's the end of a toss to a reporter, to let your energy sort of drop off as you do that. Blah, 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 blah. Here's Barry Nash with more. And the subtext for that is, and now my time is done. And that not only does that kind of suck the energy out of the start of whatever the reporter's about to do, but it takes you out of the flow of the program. So it can be much, much more powerful for you to deliver that with some energy and with a sense of anticipation, with the feeling that you are going to listen along with me and that you are interested in what the reporter's about to contribute. So it becomes more like blah, 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 da, da, da. Here's Barry Nash with more. So there's energy in you that we can feel as then we go to the next thing. By the way, that's also a really valuable tool. Any of you who are co-anchors and you're working with other talent on air, the energy with which you finish becomes the starting point for a co-anchor. And so really, really good teams are aware of that. And if you listen to them carefully, you will notice that they are not just taking turns. Mediocre teams, it might even be fair to say most teams, wind up taking turns reading. The really great, the really extraordinary teams, you have a sense that they're always aware of each other. There's a way that they are generating energy for each other and passing it back and forth and along. And when you see it and experience it, it's a really, really wonderful thing. And it's really a hallmark of great anchor teams. What we experience as chemistry sometimes has to do with what's happening as the focus goes from one person to another. So how you use pitch, the range you use in pitch is teaching us, it's telling us something about whether you know what you're talking about. By the way, that high activity in the voice is also a function of what the researchers call exploring. And for our purposes, I would designate that as really asking a question that actually segues us into the idea of pace, which researchers have found is another real teller of who we are to others. And in the researchers' world, what they're interested in is what they would call rhythm. But basically, it's the consistency of your speech, not just how fast or slow, but do you proceed in a way that is consistent, or is it halting? Is it a rhythm that is less predictable? Both have value. As a matter of fact, both are important to authenticity. An expert, someone who knows what they're talking about, someone who knows where they're going, will tend to speak with a pretty predictable rhythm. There won't be a lot of hesitation because, after all, I know the world I'm creating. I know what I'm talking about. I know what I'm leading up to. So there's a consistent rhythm and pace and energy that goes with that. On the other hand, someone who's authentically exploring something, someone who's authentically trying to understand something, the rhythm will be unpredictable. I think the experience watching it is when someone's asking a question, you see them working a little bit in their own head to find exactly the thing that they want to understand. But it's exactly the reason when I first encountered this research, I went, now I understand why I have always felt so put off by canned questions in newscasts. And I think that canned questions, along with canned, what I would call toss statements, in a lot of newscasts, we've said, well, we're not going to ask a question, but we will toss with a statement. Blah, 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 blah. Reporter Barry Nash is out there. Barry, police are really upset about this. I think those are often some of the most inauthentic moments in our newscast. Number one, the research suggests that if you read a scripted question and you read it with exactly sort of the rhythm and energy you've been reading everything else, on a subconscious level, you actually may be signaling to people, this isn't really my question. I didn't really think about this. And, by virtue of that, I can't say necessarily I'm not interested in it. I'm just executing the script I was given and the premeditated question I was handed. In a way, it neuters talent. It's another one of those things that we started to talk about a little bit last week, about one challenge that we may really need to at least be honest about, if not deal with, is that the long march and use of technology in our newsrooms and some of the processes we've created have actually taken anchors, especially, out of the thought process. We've made it possible for anchors to be fake, to pretend to know when they don't know, to ask a question or make a statement that actually came out of somebody else's head, didn't come out of the anchor at all. So as far as the delivery of it, the interest in it is contrived. It's fake. And here the research is saying, from a delivery standpoint, viewers have a way of discerning that. And at least pace is at least a part of that. And so someone who is asking an authentic question, the rhythm may be a little less predictable. Now, does that apply to every question? Of course not. Sometimes I know exactly what I want to ask and I know exactly what I'm going for. And so the question is going to come out with that energy. I guess what, though, it is really pointing back to is that we do have a way of recognizing when someone is truly engaged and someone is truly curious and someone is faking it. And I'm not sure we have much in our arsenal that is more valuable than our curiosity. I mean, the idea of being curious really goes to the heart of what journalism is about. I think over the years, our work with newscast has been misinformed a little bit sometimes by the concern that our job was to have all the answers. And so we created practices like never ask a reporter a question we haven't already cleared, because We don't want the reporter to look stupid. We don't want to ask something we don't already know. I think that's misguided. I think our great role in the world, our great service to our communities, and that is what we're talking about with these presentations. We're talking about delivering news to communities in crisis. The real service we can render is not to have all the answers, it is to ask the questions. Our job is to be relentlessly in pursuit of the truth. And that is the hard work. And that is the thing that people need from us. And we may be doing ourselves a disservice when we somehow try to lift that out of the way that we produce our newscast. Now, I know there is a lot of responsibility attached to that. And I know if we're really, truly honest, you've got to make judgment calls about talent are not created equal. And there are some who are more capable of being engaged in certain ways than others. But in the conversation about how we do our best work and how we do our highest good, it is the work of asking. It is not the work of knowing. We're constantly in pursuit of knowing. We celebrate when we know, but the real service we render is the work of asking. And this research, as far as how we talk to people is concerned, is just teaching us that human beings who are watching understand when we're really curious, when we're really engaged, and when we are just trying to put on a show. Pace plays a really important role in that. Checking my notes just to make sure there's nothing else that I want to say about that before we oh yeah, okay, good. So we get asked often when we're working with folks, especially on tracking, well, should I be faster or should I be slower? And I think one important other thing to understand about pace is the answer is human beings don't talk fast, they don't talk slow, they do both. There are times we talk quickly and we accelerate because we're going towards something, we're working towards something, we're adding detail, we're doing, and there are times needing to make a point really slows us down. And so the best delivery, the best reading isn't fast, isn't slow, it's both. And whenever we get or hear track or watch an anchor who we see using pace with that kind of variety, I generally tell myself, now I'm watching, I'm listening to a real master. I'm listening to someone who truly understands this business of being conversational and what pace has to do with that. There is one other little kind of fun thing, an interesting thing to talk about, an important thing to talk about, then I'll get off pace. And that is that the most conversational reading includes a quality that not a lot of talent understand or have mastered. And that is the real difference between reading and speaking conversationally is when someone is just speaking to you, you're not just listening to them speak, you're listening, you're watching them think. You're watching them find the words as they talk. And so there will be technically there will be little moments, there will be little pauses that happen because, I'm going into my head for just a second to find exactly the right thing that I want to say. And so someone who has truly mastered reading conversationally, you will hear their ability to actually include that as a part of of the way that they are reading. And again, the gift of it and the work of it is somehow communicating to people, look, I'm not just here regurgitating somebody else's thought process. It's my thought process. I'm present here. Another reason, by the way, we have often recommended to talent over the years that it's good not to always read things exactly as they are written. Now, I'm not talking about investigative pieces that have been vetted by the lawyers and need to be read word for very good reasons. But sometimes just as you read, making little simple things like flipping words here and there, I know most of you know what I'm talking about, has real value, because to do that, your mind has really got to be processing what you're seeing in a present way. It's just another way of mentally keeping yourself from just sort of succumbing to the possibly thoughtless work of just reading what's there. So, three big dynamics: pitch, pace, and the last, of course, is, oh, and by the way, we I said pitch was the language of conviction. I think you could describe pace as the language of interest and curiosity. You reveal how interested you are. You reveal how curious you may be, how engaged you are in the way you manage pace. And that brings us to volume, which I know if you went back to all of the follow-ups and recommendations I've written over the last almost 40 years, one of the 2 or 3 recommendations you would see the most would be manage your volume, or learn to speak at a conversational volume level, because volume is the language of connection. Again, we're here in this conversation about authenticity and about the importance of viewers feeling like we are talking to them and not at them. And one of the most important pieces of that is the level at which you project. Those of you who have our guide or who I've coached and worked with, I very often refer people to a 10-minute lecture on YouTube by a voice and speech teacher named Patsy Rodenberg. She was the head of voice and speech for the Royal Shakespeare Company. So she trained people like Ian McKellen and Judi Dench, and really regarded as one of the world's leading experts on the use of the speaking voice. And she has a beautiful description about the way we use volume in life. And she makes the point that you always have one of 3 choices. You can speak at a volume level so soft that I can. In other words, it's inside of a circle that includes only me. I'm not speaking loudly enough that it even gets to you. And of course, there's nothing about that communicates any kind of interest in connectedness. Alternatively, I can speak louder than I need to speak to reach you. I can project beyond you to what she calls the third circle, which is a circle beyond the listener. And of course, a place where many, many newscasters work. And Rodenberg makes a very, very interesting point about that. She says, that is not the level of connection, that's the level of manipulation. When someone speaks that loudly to you, they may want your attention, but they don't necessarily want anything back from you. It is domineering. It is not relational. And of course, I think it happens to newscasters for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because literally the camera's 20 feet away, even though the shot has you this close to me. I think sometimes it's just kind of a psychological compensation for the fact that you can't see the other person. It's a way of trying to create some energy. But Roddenberry makes the point, and I think it's a really, really critical and important one, that when we really want to connect, when we are really interested in the person on the other side, we calibrate our volume to exactly the distance of that exchange. I don't talk louder than I need to do to reach you. I don't talk so softly I can't reach you. I just talk as loudly as I need to do to reach you. And you'll remember last week I talked about the idea that the human communicator is a system, that adjustments in one place trigger really good things in other places. And there is often a remarkable cascade of benefit that happens when a communicator really starts to work in that level of honest relational connection. If I were going to turn it into a recommendation, which we do and which we've used in a lot of instances, it is when we talk about managing your volume, the best volume is generally whatever volume resonates the distance of the shot, not the distance of the camera, the distance of the shot. So if you're being shot as if you are 2 or 3 feet away from me, then how would you normally project in animated conversation to someone who is really 2 to 3 feet away from you? Now, again, there are exceptions to all of this and exceptions to everything, but there is something about this particular element that I think is really critical and is really important and is really kind of a doorway to our goal here, which is to have people feeling like the conversation with us is so authentic and so full of concern for them that they want to come back. It has a value that somehow transcends the need that is bringing them to our newscasts now, generated by the fear and the anxiety during the pandemic. And it may be especially important at a time like this because, again, one reason people are watching who haven't been watching is they have an emotional need. And they are looking for people who can help them through that. So what does that mean for you as the communicator? How do you work in a way that causes me to begin to trust and believe you can help me through, and in the best of circumstances, may be a relationship I would want to continue once the fear and anxiety that I am currently feeling is in the past. So just to summarize all that, a quick recap. So we've talked about today about What I think are 6 good guidelines. One is to be relentlessly honest with yourself about the language you're using with people. Is it conversational? Is it the way you would talk? Number 2, talk directly to viewers. Use second person. Put yourself in that mindset when you can. Know what you need viewers to understand, not just what's important, but what you need viewers to understand, because that's the work you're doing when you are talking to an audience. Use an expressive pitch range. Learn to work with a varied pace. And finally, use volume intentionally.